Cortés paced slowly through the halls of the palace where he and his men were quartered. Outside, the sounds of the city drifted faintly: drums, canoes moving in the canals, the murmur of tens of thousands. But inside, the air was thick with unease. The Spaniards had been in Tenochtitlan long enough to see both its majesty and its danger. Warriors by the thousands, disciplined nobles, priests who commanded fear and loyalty. They were guests, yes, but they were also intruders, surrounded at every moment. That night, Cortés called his captains together. They gathered in a dimly lit chamber, the flicker of torches throwing shadows across the walls. Alvarado, Sandoval, Velázquez de León, and others, men hardened by months of war and uncertainty. Each knew why they were there. The question hung unspoken. How long could they remain in the city as honored guests before the balance tipped against them? Cortés broke the silence. He spoke of the city's power, its riches, and its sheer size. He reminded them of what they had witnessed: the endless supply of warriors, the markets filled with resources, the temples rising above every district. All of it could turn against them in a single moment. Some captains urged caution. They warned that any rash move would bring the wrath of the entire city upon them. Others argued more boldly. If they struck first, if they seized the heart of the empire, they might hold all of Tenochtitlan in their grasp. Cortés listened, weighing every word. His gaze was steady, his hands clasped behind his back. For him, hesitation was the true danger. They were too few to rely on open battle. Their survival, and their chance at victory, depended on control. And the only way to control Tenochtitlan was to control Montezuma. The thought itself seemed unthinkable. To lay hands on the Huey Tlatoani, the great speaker, the emperor of millions. Yet Cortés argued with cold logic. So long as Montezuma commanded loyalty, the Spaniards were at risk. If the emperor became their guest, then his authority could be wielded through him. The chamber grew tense. Voices rose and fell. Some crossed themselves nervously at the audacity of the plan. Others clenched their fists, already convinced. Cortés stood tall, his words measured and clear. There was no more time to weigh fears. The city pressed in around them. Suspicion grew daily. Their only path forward was boldness. The decision was made. Tomorrow, they would confront Montezuma in his own palace. They would attempt the unthinkable. Dawn light fell over Tenochtitlan, illuminating the palace in soft gold. Cortés had positioned his men carefully overnight, along corridors, at staircases, and at entrances. Each soldier understood his orders. Inside the palace, courtiers moved with measured steps, attendants carried ceremonial offerings, and guards remained at their posts. Beneath the routine, tension was present. Cortés's gaze swept the hall, noting the posture of nobles, the arrangement of attendants, and the alertness of guards. Cortés entered the main hall. Montezuma awaited him, adorned in gold, jade, and featherwork. The emperor's posture was formal, yet his eyes revealed attention and caution. Cortés addressed him politely, through interpreters. "Great speaker, we must discuss matters vital to the safety of your city and people." The emperor inclined his head. Cortés subtly signaled the Spaniards around him. Soldiers adjusted their positions, forming a perimeter close to the emperor. Courtiers stiffened. Guards exchanged glances. At Cortés's signal, the Spaniards closed ranks around Montezuma. The emperor's composure flickered briefly. A tightened hand, a glance toward his guards. "You will remain here, under my protection," Cortés said. His tone was calm, deliberate, and measured. The meaning was clear. Montezuma was now held within the palace. A hush fell over the room. Courtiers whispered quietly. Attendants paused in mid-task. Guards hesitated, uncertain whether to act. Outside, the city continued its daily rhythm, unaware of the change within the palace. Cortés moved among the Spaniards, observing the responses of those around him. the subtle expressions of nobles, the stance of guards, the actions of attendants. Hours passed. Montezuma received only the minimum courtesies necessary to maintain appearances. Spanish soldiers maintained positions, moving discreetly to monitor entrances and corridors. Outside the palace, nobles whispered in small groups, exchanging questions and cautious remarks. Warriors adjusted formations but remained at a distance. Cortés convened his captains. They discussed the events of the day, noting which nobles appeared uncertain, which districts were most loyal, and the movements of guards and city personnel. The Spaniards maintained their positions within the palace, observing the ongoing activity and interactions. The emperor remained in the palace, attended and watched closely by both Spanish soldiers and his own guards. Courtiers and attendants continued their duties under the watchful presence of the Spaniards. The balance of daily activity in the city was maintained, but the emperor's freedom was now constrained, and key figures in the palace reacted to the new circumstances. The moment Cortés placed his hand on Montezuma, the palace fell into stunned silence. Courtiers froze in disbelief, attendants halted mid-step, and the guards at the doors shifted uneasily. No one dared move first. Montezuma himself remained composed. His face betrayed neither panic nor outrage, but the weight of what had happened was unmistakable. He was no longer free, though he still wore the feathered crown of the Huey Tlatoani. The Spaniards closed ranks, steel at the ready. The torchlight caught the edges of their weapons, casting long reflections across the polished floors. Courtiers averted their gaze, and muted whispers threaded through the hallways, carrying unease from one chamber to the next. Outside, the news traveled quickly. Crowds gathered near the palace walls, uncertain and restless. Some called out the emperor's name, others waited in tense silence. No one yet understood if Montezuma was still ruling, or if power had slipped into foreign hands. Cortés acted swiftly. He ordered Spanish guards to secure every entrance and stationed men along the causeways to watch for movement. Inside, he allowed Montezuma to continue his rituals and receive visitors, but under constant supervision. The emperor's dignity remained intact, yet the message was unmistakable. He was a sovereign under watch. Among the nobles, outrage simmered. Many saw the seizure as an unforgivable insult, but without Montezuma's command, their anger had no outlet. Obsidian knives hissed against whetstones as warriors prepared in silence. Priests lifted their voices in ritual song, the sound carrying across rooftops and canals. Beneath it all, Tenochtitlan waited, as though the vast city had paused to listen. For now, restraint prevailed. Montezuma stepped forward onto the palace platform, his figure still draped in the rich mantle of his office. He raised his hand for silence, and the vast square below hushed. With calm authority, he spoke to his people. He told them that the strangers were his friends, that they had come in peace, and that no one should resist or take up arms. He commanded them to remain at their work, to continue their offerings to the gods, and to obey him as they always had. The words carried the weight of the great speaker, but doubt flickered across the crowd. Some lowered their eyes. Others muttered quietly, unsettled by the sight before them, their emperor speaking under the watch of foreign guards. At Montezuma's side, the Spaniards stood armed and vigilant. Their silent presence gave the message a different meaning. To the people of Tenochtitlan, it was not only their emperor's voice they heard, but also the shadow of the men who now constrained him. The city remained quiet, but beneath that silence ran unease. The crowd dispersed slowly, some casting wary glances back at the platform. The emperor of the Mexica still sat upon his throne, yet his freedom was gone. Within the walls of his own palace, Montezuma had become both ruler and captive, the most powerful man of the Mexica Empire, held fast by a handful of foreign soldiers. The palace corridors were tense. Courtiers whispered urgently among themselves, some retreating to confer with allies, others lingering near the emperor to gauge his reaction. Ambitious nobles weighed their options carefully, uncertain whether to act or wait. Cortés moved deliberately through the main hall, speaking quietly to his captains. He stationed guards at key passageways, staircases, and entrances, controlling who could see or speak with Montezuma. Every movement of the Spaniards was calculated, but outwardly calm. Outside the palace, the city stirred. Warriors in ceremonial attire marched along the causeways, drums and flutes echoing, while citizens paused, murmuring about what had just occurred. The tension in the streets was tangible. Rumors spread quickly, each telling different versions of the event. Inside, Montezuma continued his duties under watch. He received nobles and advisors, responded to questions, and maintained ceremonial composure. Yet the presence of Spanish soldiers never left him, a reminder that every decision was being observed. Cortés quietly conferred with the nobles who had shown flexibility or ambition. Through discreet conversation, he gauged their loyalties and sought to solidify support, ensuring that the most influential figures would not oppose him when decisive action came. The palace itself had shifted in meaning. It was still the emperor's residence, but it had become the center of an unfolding power struggle. For the people of Tenochtitlan, the sight of their emperor under watch was both startling and unsettling. Some avoided the palace entirely, while others lingered at a distance, eager to witness what might come next. The day passed with careful observation, planning, and subtle maneuvering. The Spaniards remained in control, yet Montezuma's calm authority prevented immediate chaos. But the balance was delicate. A single misstep by either side could ignite the city. And in the minds of all present, Spaniards and Mexica alike, a profound change was taking hold. The palace, the emperor, and the empire itself had entered a new chapter, one that would shape the coming days in ways no one could yet fully grasp. The following day, Cortés moved through the palace. He met privately with a few nobles who had shown willingness to cooperate, discussing minor requests and listening closely to their concerns. Each conversation revealed nuances of court politics, rivalries, ambitions, and the subtle ways loyalty shifted in Montezuma's absence of absolute control. Outside the palace, Tenochtitlan stirred with a heightened awareness. Citizens moved through the causeways with caution, and the marketplace buzzed with a nervous energy. Warriors patrolled the streets, their feathered headdresses and polished shields marking their status, yet their glances often flicked toward the palace. The people sensed a change, though few could name its cause. Inside, Montezuma continued his ceremonial duties. He oversaw offerings to the gods, received emissaries, and listened to petitions. His voice remained steady, measured, commanding respect. Yet the presence of Spanish soldiers was unmistakable. Cortés and his captains mapped the palace and surrounding districts, noting which gates could be controlled, which sections of the city might resist, and which influential nobles could be relied upon to mediate. This intelligence would guide any decisive action, should it become necessary. By afternoon, a ceremonial display drew the attention of both Spaniards and citizens. Warriors demonstrated formations, and priests performed rituals in the temple precincts. Cortés positioned his men nearby, watching reactions, observing loyalties, and gauging potential disruptions. The procession passed without incident, yet the atmosphere was tense, a reminder that control was fragile and temporary. As the sun dipped, Cortés reviewed the day's observations with his captains. They had confirmed which nobles could be influenced, which districts were pliable, and how the flow of people and resources could be monitored. Montezuma remained in ceremonial control, but the Spaniards had solidified their capacity to act decisively. The palace had become a stage for power. The emperor's dignity persisted, but the reality was clear. Authority had been partially transferred, and the empire's future depended on the next moves. One day, as activity stirred through the palace and its courtyards, a messenger arrived with urgent news. A neighboring district had begun to gather armed warriors, restless after rumors of the emperor's captivity. Cortés immediately dispatched scouts and positioned guards along the main causeways. The city's calm veneer was cracking. Inside, Montezuma continued his duties, his expressions composed but revealing fleeting moments of concern. He spoke to loyal nobles, seeking reassurance, while others skirted around him, uncertain how far to push or when to act. Cortés saw the moment approaching when subtle influence would need to turn into direct action to maintain leverage over the court. Outside the palace, the murmur of gathering groups grew louder. From the rooftops, sentries reported the slow convergence of warriors, some carrying obsidian-tipped spears, others with shields glinting in the sunlight. Cortés moved among his men, positioning them where the streets funneled toward the causeways, ensuring access points remained under watch without provoking confrontation. Within the palace, Montezuma held audience with the nobles who remained near him. His words were measured, encouraging obedience and calm, yet his eyes flicked repeatedly toward the Spanish guards. Even the most loyal courtiers sensed the limits of his autonomy. Cortés seized the opportunity. He called a private meeting with the nobles who had shown ambition or wavering loyalty. Speaking quietly, he laid out expectations and incentives, reinforcing that cooperation with the Spaniards offered protection and advantage. As the sun rose higher, scouts returned with updates. The gathering warriors were organized and restless, their commanders debating whether to march or wait. Cortés signaled his captains to maintain readiness but avoid overt action, keeping the city's attention focused on the palace while he orchestrated subtle shifts in allegiance. Meanwhile, Montezuma oversaw offerings and consultations with priests. His gestures remained ceremonial, but his mind worked quickly, calculating how to maintain control and prevent outright rebellion. The emperor's authority had become a delicate balancing act. He ruled, but under the eyes of armed strangers. Cortés moved through the palace halls, conferring quietly with his captains. Plans were refined and positions adjusted to cover every likely approach while avoiding unnecessary visibility. Soldiers stationed at causeways and gates remained alert but inconspicuous, blending into the palace routines. He then summoned the nobles who had shown ambition or flexibility. In a hushed room, away from the main hall, he pressed subtly, reminding them of past grievances, highlighting the risks of inaction and hinting at the advantages of siding with the Spaniards. Some shifted uneasily, others nodded with careful calculation. The fractures in loyalty were becoming clearer. Outside, the gathered warriors shifted positions, murmuring among themselves, still uncertain whether to advance or withdraw. Scouts provided continual updates to Cortés, who adjusted his men accordingly. He made sure that no single group could move without being observed, while keeping the perception that the palace still controlled the streets. Cortés waited for the precise moment. When reports indicated that the gathering warriors were poised but undecided, he quietly ordered a small detachment to move into positions that would block any sudden surge. His objective was not open conflict, at least not yet, but to make clear that any act of defiance would meet immediate resistance. In the palace, Montezuma's advisors whispered among themselves. Some sought to reassure him, others gauged whether the Spaniards' control could be resisted. The emperor's calm exterior hid a mind calculating the options, each choice weighted against unknown consequences.